Something unusual just happened in the Persian Gulf. American warplanes carried out a strike on Iran's most important oil export island, Kharg Island, a small piece of land sitting in the northern Persian Gulf that most Americans have never heard of. But here is the strange part. The bombs did not touch the oil facilities. They hit something else entirely. And that one decision, that deliberate choice to spare the oil, may tell us more about what Washington is actually doing here than any press briefing or official statement ever will. Because Kharg Island is not just another location on a map. Nearly 90% of Iran's oil exports move through this island. Every tanker that carries Iranian oil to the rest of the world loads up here. The pipelines, the terminals, the storage tanks, all of it sits on this small island in the Gulf. If those facilities had been destroyed, the global energy market would have moved within hours. Oil prices would have jumped. Fuel costs would have climbed. Markets from London to Tokyo would have reacted before the smoke even cleared. But they were not touched. So the question writes itself. Why fly warplanes all the way to one of the most strategically sensitive islands on the planet, and then pull back from the one thing that would cause maximum economic damage? That question is the center of this entire story. And by the time we reach the end of this video, you are going to understand the one strategic calculation that explains the whole operation. The calculation that most headlines are completely missing. The calculation that tells you what the United States is actually trying to accomplish and whether it is going to work. Stay with me. Because this story goes much deeper than a bombing raid. Here is why this matters right now today, and not just as a foreign policy story that happened somewhere far away. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway at the bottom of the Persian Gulf. At its narrowest point, it is roughly 21 miles wide. That is it. 21 miles of water between the Iranian coast and the tip of the Arabian Peninsula. And through those 21 miles, every single day, somewhere between 17 and 21 million barrels of oil pass through. That is approximately 1/5 of all the oil traded anywhere in the world, every single day. Saudi oil moves through it, UAE oil moves through it, Iraqi oil moves through it, Kuwaiti oil moves through it, Qatar's liquefied natural gas, which heats homes across Europe and powers factories across Asia, moves through it. That waterway is not just important. It is the single most important choke point in global energy supply. If something disrupts the Strait of Hormuz, the entire world feels it within days. And Kharg Island sits at the top of the Persian Gulf, directly connected to the pipeline network that feeds oil into the tankers that then travel through that strait. So when the United States conducted this strike, it was not doing so in isolation. It was doing so inside a situation that was already tense, already fragile, already being watched by every energy market, every navy, and every foreign ministry on the planet. The strike did not happen because of a random decision. It happened inside a specific context. A context involving months of rising tension, incidents at sea, and a broader disagreement about Iran's nuclear program that has been building for years. That context is what makes this moment so significant, and that context is exactly what most coverage is rushing past to get to the next headline. So let us start at the beginning and walk through exactly what happened. American military aircraft conducted strikes on Kharg Island targeting what officials described as Iranian military assets, anti-aircraft systems, command and control infrastructure. military positions that had been established on the island alongside the civilian oil operations. The strikes were precise. They were planned. This was not a reactive decision made in a moment of crisis. The level of coordination involved in a strike of this nature, the flight paths, the target selection, the timing, the diplomatic communications that would have happened before and immediately after, all of it points to a decision that was thought through carefully, probably over a period of weeks. What makes the strike unusual is what was not hit. The oil terminals were left intact. The loading facilities were left intact. The storage tanks were left intact. The pipelines connecting the island to the Iranian mainland were left intact. If the goal had been to cripple Iran's economy, those facilities would have been the primary targets. Destroy the loading terminals and Iran cannot export oil. Cannot export oil and the government's primary source of revenue collapses within months. But that is not what happened. The military assets were hit, the economic assets were not. And here is the part that almost nobody is talking about. That distinction is not accidental, it is a message. A very specific, very deliberate message. And understanding what that message says and who it is aimed at is the key to understanding this entire operation. When a military force has the capability to destroy something completely, chooses to destroy only part of it, and makes sure the world knows that choice was deliberate, that is not a military operation in the traditional sense. That is communication. It is coercive diplomacy using military force as the language. The message being sent has a very clear meaning. We can destroy the whole thing. We chose not to. We are giving you a choice. Make the right one. Whether that message will be received the way Washington intends is a completely different question. And it is one we are going to get into in detail. But first, you need to understand exactly why Kharg Island is the location that carries this kind of weight. Because without that context, none of the strategic logic makes sense. Now this is where the story takes a surprising turn. Kharg Island has been at the center of conflict before. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Iraq repeatedly targeted Kharg Island as part of a broader strategy to cut off Iran's oil revenue and force a negotiated end to the war. Iraqi aircraft struck the island's facilities multiple times throughout that conflict. Iran repaired the damage, kept the oil flowing, kept fighting. The lesson from that history is significant. Hitting Kharg Island, even hitting it hard, does not automatically cripple Iran. Iran has shown a remarkable ability to repair, adapt, and continue operating even under sustained military pressure on its oil infrastructure. Which raises an important question. If the United States knows this history, and it does, then what exactly was the point of a strike that deliberately avoided the oil infrastructure anyway? The answer brings us back to the message logic, but it also brings us to something else. Something about the current state of Iran's economy that makes the timing of this strike particularly important. In the months leading up to this strike, Iran had actually been increasing its oil exports. Despite heavy sanctions, despite being cut off from most of the global financial system, Iran found ways to move oil primarily to China through a network of third-party intermediaries and what are sometimes called ghost tankers. Vessels that turn off their location tracking and move oil quietly from point to point. This workaround had been generating real revenue for Tehran, more than previous years. Enough to give the Iranian government some financial breathing room at a moment when its economy was under serious domestic pressure. The strike on Kharg Island, even the limited one that took place, puts that revenue stream at risk in a new way. Not because the oil facilities were hit, but because of what the strike demonstrates. It demonstrates that the United States has the capability, the willingness, and the operational reach to hit Kharg Island whenever it chooses. The next strike might not be so restrained. That threat, the implied threat of a future, larger strike, hangs over every barrel of Iranian oil that tries to move through the Gulf from this point forward. And here is what that means practically. Insurance companies that cover oil tankers make their decisions based on risk assessments. The moment the risk level in a given area rises, even on the basis of a potential threat rather than an actual one, insurance rates go up. When insurance rates go up enough, shipping companies start avoiding the area. When shipping companies avoid the area, oil stops moving. Not because of a bomb, because of the fear of a bomb. This is how great power competition actually works in the modern era. You do not have to destroy something to affect it. You just have to make it expensive and uncertain enough that the economic calculation changes on its own. Now let us talk about the Strait of Hormuz itself, because this is where the real risk lives. And this is the part of the story that goes directly from the Persian Gulf to your daily life. 21 million barrels of oil per day. 1/5 of global supply, through a channel barely wider than the distance between two exits on a highway. Iran has been aware of the strategic value of the Strait of Hormuz for decades. The ability to threaten or disrupt that waterway is Iran's most powerful economic weapon. Not its military, not its nuclear program, its geography. The simple fact that its coastline runs along the northern edge of the most important shipping lane in the world. Iran has invested heavily in the ability to threaten this waterway without necessarily closing it entirely. It has fast attack boats that can harass tankers. It has anti-ship missiles positioned along its coastline that can reach across the strait. It has underwater mines that can be laid quietly, and it has made no secret of the fact that any military escalation could trigger a response in those waters. The last time there was a serious incident in the strait, in 2019, when a series of tanker attacks occurred and Iran seized a British-flagged vessel, oil prices moved immediately. Not by a small amount, by a significant enough amount that energy markets around the world took notice. And that was for an incident that did not involve any direct US-Iran military engagement. We are now past that point. The United States has conducted a direct military strike on Iranian territory. Iranian soil has been hit by American weapons. Whatever the internal debate in Tehran looks like right now, the political pressure on the Iranian leadership to respond in a way that demonstrates strength to their own population is enormous. The Iranian government has to answer to its people. It has to show that this strike did not go unanswered, that Iran is not simply absorbing blows without consequence. The question is not whether Iran will respond. The question is how. And what constraints, both practical and strategic, shape what they actually do. And what happened next changed the entire calculation, because Iran's options are not unlimited. And the choices they make in the coming days will tell us a great deal about where this situation is actually headed. Let us walk through what Iran can realistically do. The first option is a military response directly against American assets. This is the option that carries the highest risk of full-scale escalation. The United States has significant military presence in the region, aircraft carriers, Air bases in friendly Gulf states. Thousands of troops positioned across Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, and other locations. A direct Iranian strike on any of those positions would trigger an American response that Iran's conventional military is not equipped to absorb. Iran knows this. Iranian military planners understand the gap between their conventional capabilities and those of the United States. A direct conventional military confrontation is not a scenario Iran wants to enter. The second option is proxy escalation. Iran has built, funded, and armed a network of allied militant groups across the region over decades. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen. Various Shia militia groups in Iraq and Syria. These groups can act in ways that create pressure on the United States and its allies without Iran having to engage directly. The Houthis in Yemen have already demonstrated in recent years that they can launch drones and missiles that hit targets far from where they are based. They have targeted shipping in the Red Sea. They have hit infrastructure inside Saudi Arabia. A surge of proxy activity following this strike is a realistic and relatively lower-risk option for Tehran. The third option involves the Strait of Hormuz. Not necessarily closing it, which Iran knows would trigger an overwhelming military response, but threatening it. Moving anti-ship missile systems to more visible positions on the coast. Conducting naval exercises that signal readiness. Allowing ambiguous incidents in the shipping lanes that raise fear without providing clear justification for a massive American response. This third option is the most economically powerful and the most politically useful for Iran in the short term. It creates pressure without crossing a clear line. The fourth option is the nuclear card. Iran's nuclear program has been a central point of tension with the United States and Europe for over 2 decades. Iran has the technical capability to enrich uranium to higher levels than it currently does. Moving in that direction, announcing new enrichment steps, installing additional centrifuges, reducing cooperation with international inspectors, would bring the entire international community back to the negotiating table and would generate enormous diplomatic pressure on Washington to explain what it is actually trying to achieve. Each of these options carries different risks and different potential benefits for Tehran. Which path Iran chooses, or which combination of paths, will shape the next chapter of this story significantly. And now we reach the part of this story that very few people in the mainstream coverage are actually asking about. The one question that sits at the center of everything. Why now? Why did this strike happen at this specific moment in time? Because military operations of this scale and this significance do not happen without context. They do not happen in a vacuum. They happen when someone in a position of authority decides that the moment is right, that the conditions have aligned, that the risk of acting is lower than the risk of waiting. So what was happening in the weeks and months before this strike? There had been reports, not prominently placed reports, not front-page stories, but reports in foreign policy publications, in diplomatic journals, in the kind of coverage that serious analysts follow, suggesting that back-channel conversations between American and Iranian officials had been occurring. Not full formal negotiations, not a public diplomatic process, but quiet conversations about the possibility of a framework, a path toward an agreement on Iran's nuclear program that might involve some sanctions relief in exchange for limits on enrichment. Separate from that, there were also reports of Iranian activity near American assets in the region that raised concern within the military and intelligence communities. Specific, credible intelligence about potential Iranian moves in the strait or against U.S. positions. These two things, a possible diplomatic opening and a credible military threat, existed at the same time. And the strike happened in that context. If you believe the first story, the diplomatic opening, then the timing of this strike raises serious questions about whether Washington actually wants a negotiated outcome with Iran, or whether there are elements within the foreign policy establishment that view any accommodation with Tehran as unacceptable regardless of what it might achieve. If you believe the second story, the intelligence about an imminent Iranian threat, then the strike was a preemptive defensive action necessary to prevent something worse, and the timing was driven by events on the ground rather than by political calculation. I cannot tell you with certainty which story is correct. Nobody outside a very small number of decision makers can tell you that right now. The full intelligence picture is not public. The internal deliberations are not public. The diplomatic back channel, if it existed, is not public. What I can tell you is that both stories cannot be equally true at the same time. Either this strike was defensive and urgent, or it was a strategic choice made by people who decided that escalation served their goals better than negotiation. That distinction matters enormously for what comes next. Because if this was defensive, then the administration will be working to find off-ramps, ways to let both sides pull back from the edge without either side losing face publicly. That kind of managed de-escalation is difficult, but it has happened before in US-Iran relations. But if this was a strategic choice by people who want sustained pressure on Iran regardless of diplomatic consequences, then there are no off-ramps being planned. The pressure continues. The escalation ladder gets climbed, and the question becomes not whether things get worse but how much worse and how fast. Let us bring this down from the strategic level for a moment and talk about what all of this actually means for ordinary people. For you, for the cost of filling up your car, for the price of things at the grocery store, for the broader economic environment that affects everyone watching this. Oil is embedded in almost everything, not just gasoline. The cost of shipping goods, the cost of manufacturing, the cost of heating homes. When oil prices move, the effects ripple outward across the entire economy in ways that are not always obvious but are very real. The Persian Gulf region produces a significant share of the world's oil supply. The countries that border the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq, Kuwait, Iran itself, collectively produce a substantial portion of what the global economy runs on every day. A sustained disruption in that region, not even a catastrophic one, just a sustained period of uncertainty and elevated risk, would push oil prices higher. Not necessarily to extreme levels immediately, but higher. And higher oil prices sustained over months translate into higher fuel costs, higher shipping costs, higher prices for manufactured goods, and eventually higher inflation across the economy. This is not speculation. This is the historical pattern from every major Middle East escalation of the past 50 years. The 1973 oil embargo, the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the Gulf War in 1990. The 2019 tanker incidents. Every time tension rises significantly in the Persian Gulf, the energy market reacts. The United States is now in the middle of a direct military exchange with Iran. That is a new and significant development, and the energy market is watching every signal about what comes next. There is one more dimension to this story that is worth examining carefully: the international reaction. When the United States conducts a military operation of this scale, the response from other major powers matters. Not just because of diplomatic relationships, but because of what those responses tell us about whether the U.S. is acting with broader international support or acting essentially alone. China has enormous economic interest in the stability of Persian Gulf oil flows. A significant portion of the oil that moves through the Strait of Hormuz is headed to China. Chinese energy security is directly tied to stability in this region. Beijing will be watching this situation with a level of attention that most American political coverage does not acknowledge. Russia, despite its own complicated situation, maintains relationships with Iran that give it a degree of influence in Tehran. Russian and Iranian interests are not identical, but they overlap in enough areas that Moscow's response to this situation matters. European governments are in a difficult position. They depend on stable energy markets. They have their own historical investments in Iranian nuclear diplomacy going back to the original deal that was signed in 2015. They will want to understand clearly what Washington is trying to achieve and whether there is still a diplomatic path forward. And the Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, are in a particularly complex position. They share American concerns about Iranian power in the region. Many of them have been quietly working toward their own diplomatic adjustments with Tehran in recent years. A major escalation between the US and Iran puts all of those adjustments under pressure. The international picture matters because the United States, whatever its military capabilities, cannot manage the consequences of sustained escalation in the Persian Gulf alone. Energy stability, shipping security, diplomatic management of Iran's nuclear ambitions. All of these require a degree of international cooperation that only functions if America's allies and partners are willing to work together toward shared goals. If this strike was perceived internationally as unilateral, disproportionate, or strategically unwise, the willingness of partners to support American objectives in the region diminishes. And without that support, managing the aftermath becomes significantly harder. Let us come back now to where we started. The bombs fell on Kharg Island. The oil infrastructure was spared. A message was sent. What does that message actually say? And will it accomplish what it was designed to accomplish? Here is what I believe based on the strategic logic, the historical record, and the available evidence. The United States has demonstrated two things with this strike. First, that it has the capability and the willingness to hit Iranian territory directly. That matters. It removes any Iranian assumption that American reluctance to escalate is unlimited. Second, that it is not yet willing to go to the point of causing a global economic crisis by destroying Iran's oil export capacity. That restraint signals that Washington is not seeking a full-scale war. In theory, that combination, willingness to act, combined with visible restraint, should create space for Tehran to respond in a measured way and for back-channel communication to happen. That is the strategic logic. Coercive diplomacy, apply pressure, leave an exit door open, hope the other side walks through it. The problem with that logic is that it requires the Iranian leadership to read the situation the same way Washington does. To see the same exit door, to trust that the restraint shown today will continue if Iran makes a concession tomorrow. That kind of trust does not exist between these two governments. It has not existed for decades. The history of US-Iran relations is a long series of moments where signals were misread, intentions were misunderstood, and actions that one side intended as limited were received by the other side as confirmation of the worst assumptions. There is nothing in the current relationship between Washington and Tehran that suggests either side has developed the kind of reliable communication channel that would allow coercive diplomacy to work the way it is designed to work. Which means the most likely outcome is not a clean de-escalation. It is not a rapid path to a negotiated agreement. It is a prolonged period of elevated tension, sporadic incidents, proxy activity in multiple locations across the region, continued pressure on oil markets, and ongoing uncertainty about where the next escalation point will come from and when. That is not a prediction of war. It is a description of a situation that has moved into a more dangerous phase, one that requires more sustained attention, more careful management, and more honest public debate than it is currently receiving. And that brings us to the revelation I promised at the beginning of this video. The one insight that changes how you look at this entire story. Here it is. The most significant thing about this strike is not the military result. It is the diplomatic cost. In the weeks before this strike, there were signs, quiet, tentative, but real signs, that a conversation was beginning between Washington and Tehran about a possible framework, not a full agreement. Not a solved problem, but a conversation, a channel, a possibility. That conversation is now, at minimum, severely damaged, possibly ended. If you believe that negotiation with Iran is ultimately necessary, that military pressure alone cannot solve the nuclear question, cannot stabilize the region, cannot protect American interests over the long term, then the loss of that conversation is a serious cost. A cost that will not show up in the immediate military analysis. A cost that will not be reported on the front pages, but a cost that will be felt in the months and years ahead as the problem of Iran's nuclear program continues without a diplomatic path toward resolution. History is full of moments where military options were chosen over diplomatic ones at precisely the point when the diplomatic option was closest to bearing fruit. Sometimes that choice was necessary because the threat was immediate and real. Sometimes that choice was made because the people making it did not believe in the diplomatic option in the first place. Which of those describes this moment is something only the people in the decision-making rooms can answer honestly. What you can do, what this video is trying to give you the tools to do, is ask that question. Not accept the framing that this was simply a military necessity with no alternatives. Not dismiss it as reckless warmongering with no legitimate strategic rationale, but sit with the real complexity of it. The genuine uncertainty about motivation. The real consequences for oil markets, for regional stability, for American credibility, and for the slim but real possibility of a negotiated path forward. Because that complexity is where the truth lives, and the truth is what you came here for. If this analysis gave you something real, something beyond what you got from the headline, then subscribe. Not because subscriber counts matter more than substance, but because this story is nowhere near finished. Iran will respond, the Strait of Hormuz will be tested, oil markets will react. And when those things happen, I will be right here breaking it down the same way we just did. No spin, no panic, just clear, honest, fact-based analysis. Leave one comment below, one question. The one thing about this situation that you most want to understand better. I read them. They shape the next video. Your question might be the starting point for the analysis that comes next. And if you know someone who is trying to make sense of what is happening in the Middle East right now, someone who is tired of getting 30 seconds on the evening news and nothing that actually explains anything, share this video with them. Not because the view count matters, because understanding matters. And right now, real understanding is hard to find.